As we study Paul's private letter to Philemon, a resident of the Colossian church, it's important to understand slavery in the Roman Empire. And the reason why I think it's so important that we understand slavery at this time in the first century is because 1/3 of the population in the Roman Empire was in slavery. 1 out of 3. That means in the United States that 100 million United States citizens would be in slavery. 100 million. So what does that mean for the spread of the gospel? That's what we're going to look at as well. So slavery was very important in the Roman Empire, and of course the runaway slave of Philemon was Onesimus. We'll kind of tie him in here and there. Why were there slaves in the Roman Empire? Well, the economy was dependent on slave labor, both skilled and unskilled. Slavery was not invented by the Romans. Obviously, Abraham had slaves. This was something that went back thousands of years before the time of Paul. What was different, however, is that the Roman Empire used their slaves to drive the empire and to sustain the empire for many years. So the economy is the key idea here. The economy was dependent on slave labor, skilled and unskilled. So how were slaves used? Well, slaves worked in mines and in factories, so more of the unskilled jobs. Slaves sometimes ran households, estates, and the business of their owners. So essentially, slaves were the machines of their day. Now consider Onesimus. So what kind of slave do you think he was? Do you think he was skilled or unskilled? Well, you could come at it from two different perspectives. You could look at it from the fact that he stole. You could look at it from the fact that, well, he had good position and maybe took advantage of that position and was tempted. He could have ran the household. He could have ran the business. We're not exactly sure. The Bible doesn't tell us, but it's interesting to discuss what type of slave, in fact, Onesimus was. Impact of slaves on the Roman Empire. Well, the idea of slavery, of course, is old, but the economic dependence of the Roman Empire on slavery was a newer idea. And so there were 3 reasons for the increase in slaves. Number 1, when they took over and conquered territories, more slaves got brought in. So that's, of course, a reason for increase. But what happens is those slaves that come in are sold as prisoners of war, sold at auction. And that helps to make the army stronger, finance the army. And as the army gets stronger, what is it able to do? It's able to take over more territory. And what happens when it takes over more territory? You bring in more slaves. So this concept led to an expansion of the empire. This is why the Roman Empire was able to grow rapidly, because of slaves and how they were sold and used to finance the army. They were also used as a reward for conquerors. As they maybe took over a certain area, a certain town, they were given the incentive that if you can take over this area, we will give you this many slaves. So as they became a reward for different people in leadership, that also led to the increase in slave traders. So what do you think about when you think of the word slave? Do you think of cruelty? Do you think of a difficult life? Do you think of somebody with an apron on cooking dinner? What do you think of when the Bible talks about you and I being slaves for Christ? What exactly does that mean? Well, we're not really used to slavery. You might think you're a slave in your house because your parents don't let you do anything. But slavery was a real thing, and it was cruel. It was difficult. It was a hard life, and as we'll see in a minute, there was really nothing you could do about it. So our meaning of slave here in the year in the 21st century is much weaker than what those who read Paul's letter understood. When Paul talks about being a slave for Christ, when Paul talks about the flight of Onesimus, they understood what he was talking about because slaves were everywhere. Our meaning for slave is kind of this romantic type of idea, and I don't mean like affectionate romance. I mean this idea that it's a quaint charm of being a slave for Christ, that this is something easy and exciting. Now, don't get me wrong, being a slave for Christ is exciting. Who else would you rather belong to? But being a slave for Christ means a difficult life, and it means suffering, and it means perhaps getting mocked for your faith and enduring hardships. So we have to understand the word slave and what it really means in the context of Paul's writing. Now, how do you become a slave? There's 3 ways to enter into slavery. And this is important because you might ask yourself, 1/3 of the population was in slavery? How did you get into slavery? The first way is you were captured. I talked earlier about prisoners of war. So that's pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. The second way is you were born to a slave mother. So just as Paul immediately got Roman citizenship when his father, because he was born of his father, same thing negatively with slavery. When you were born of a slave, you were a slave. Ishmael was a slave automatically because his mother was a slave. So a child acquired the mother status at the time of birth. The third way to enter into slavery involves being sold into slavery, selling yourself or yielding oneself as a slave, and this involves involuntary or voluntary slavery. It could be a kidnapping and somebody is sold into slavery, complete injustice. But it could also be somebody putting themselves on the slave market. Now, why would somebody do that? I bet if you think about it a little bit, you'll think back to the Old Testament with Elisha and the widow and how she couldn't pay her debts. And what would happen to her if she couldn't pay her debts? Her children would be slaves. Similarly, in the first century, if you couldn't pay your debts, what would you do? You'd have to pay off those debts somehow. So a parent, a mother or a father might put themselves into slavery for the sake of their children. That's why you would put yourself into slavery. It seems amazing, but a parent will do a lot for their children. Slaves could be transferred. They were considered human livestock. So, as not being considered people, they could be transferred to other owners without any say on their part. They could often be transferred with a purchase price. So, this slave is worth quite a bit of money, so I'll give you 2 slaves, and this amount. It was a business transaction. Think about athletes in professional sports, how they get traded. Sometimes 1 player for 2, or 1 player for 1. The difference is these slaves had no say, and they weren't getting paid millions of dollars. So, how did you get out of slavery? 2 ways for a slave to pass out of slavery. The first is they die. That's obvious. And for the child of God who was a slave, that must have been a tremendous blessing, because they didn't have to endure that life of hardship and difficulty. Although I should say, not every master was cruel, because you remember that Paul instructed the masters to treat their slaves with kindness. So there were good conditions, but generally speaking, masters did not treat their slaves with kindness. So when a slave died, they were of course free in the presence of Jesus Christ, if they were a child of God. But there might have been a situation where a slave was freed. Consider Onesimus. Now we'll talk about this a little bit. I want you to consider, as a final thought here, was Onesimus freed from Philemon? Think about Paul's letter as we read it later on. Do you think Philemon freed Onesimus because Onesimus was converted by the Apostle Paul? That could happen. Maybe it did happen. That's not really the most important thing here. The most important thing is to see the spiritual meaning behind slavery and how you and I are slaves for Christ and called to follow him in all things.